me go ahead and get started here. First things first is our agenda. No presentation is set without that, and it's going to be broken down into three parts. So I'm going to go over some parking lot requirements that we'll have, and then different types of parking lots, so just breaking down the basics of these three different types, the subterranean surface and above ground structures. And then we'll talk about some unique parking lot features, as well as I'm going to take this opportunity to present to you some code changes for the new 2016 California Building Code, and also the 2016 Cal Green, some things that were added. So we'll go ahead and get right to it. So the first things first, right? You've been asked to provide a new facility for your company, and what's the first thing you need to know, right? How many parking spaces do we need? You'd be surprised how many times that potentially drives how big of a building we can provide. So we have a certain site, it's this big, right? And we need to know how many people are going to be there, and then kind of working backwards based on how many parking spaces we can provide. And that also has to do with the budget of the project, because not everybody can do 10 floors underground and 10 above or something like that. That's kind of a very expensive way to park. So we're going to go through first the client-driven factors. And like I said, the first thing is, what type of building are we doing? Is this going to be a warehouse? Is it going to be an office building, a restaurant, a hotel like we are in today, or a convention center, that kind of thing? And then another factor that always gets kind of brought into the equation would be the actual head count. So zoning may say that you need to provide 250 parking spaces, but you guys are actually needing to provide space for 300 people. So meeting the zoning requirement doesn't make any sense in that point. So you'll definitely want to be considering the actual head count. The last large project that I worked on, and it's kind of part of this case study here today, the actual head count and their shift changes were the main driving factors in determining how many parking spaces that we were going to be providing. So after we determine the client-driven factors here, we'll be looking at our different regulatory requirements. Every single project is going to be different. Every jurisdiction has their own requirements. And so we're going to use the City of San Diego, because we're in the City of San Diego, and so and they have a good framework for this as we look at today. And then we'll go ahead and kind of go through it. So these things that are listed here we'll be going through as we go through the presentation. So first things first, every project starts with getting a parcel information checklist. So whether it's City of San Diego or County of San Diego, they all kind of start with a similar type of form. And we're going to use a building that I'm very familiar with. It's actually our office building at 4499 Ruffin Road. And it's in Kearny Mesa. So have you guys ever been to Kearny Mesa? Have you ever gone to lunch in Kearny Mesa? Tried to park anywhere? Yeah. I have, and I bring lunch every day because it's not worth it. But anyway, we are in the IL 2-1 zone, which means a bunch of things, but only one thing matters to us today, and that is how many parking spaces we need. So the other thing to keep in mind is there's also overlay zones that could impact this. Some of them, like we have parking impact and prime industrial land, those things are going to have impacts on the number of parking stalls. So if you do run into a situation where you are in one of these overlay zones, or in some areas like North Park and Hillcrest, those are very dense areas that have their own requirements. So you might be given some relief there based on just the actual area you're in. So we are looking at the IL 2-1 zone for our case study here, which is our office building. And anybody from the City of San Diego here before? No. One thing they do here is they've got a couple of different requirements. So it depends on your project. This could change. But essentially what we're looking at is 2 or 3 different charts that we'll be needing to reference to figure out how many parking spaces are required, and also what our maximum number of stalls will be. So if we were to go right into the general requirement, which is the table E here, it it's a little aggressive. So those of you who have done this before kind of know that 5 parking stalls per 1,000 square feet of building area is pretty intense. That's going to be a lot of parking that you'll have to provide. And you probably don't want to do that. The maximum permitted, again, this has a laser, is another good thing to keep in mind, because a lot of spaces, or a lot of properties, like I mentioned, might want to park as much as possible to make it a more attractive development. So you're not having to say, well, these people can park here, but everybody else has to park on the street or in that lot that's around the corner up the hill and behind the bushes kind of thing. So, and nobody wants to have to make that decision, right? So the next thing when we look at it is the actual zone here. So I put it back to the table, and it's because our project doesn't meet this requirement because it is part of the uses covered in here, and they kind of worded in the negative by saying the uses that are not covered. But we are part of these 2 tables, F and G, which are, I believe it's restaurants and dining facilities, and then also this is the commercial uses. And so our building is currently being used as a business or office kind of professional type building. That puts us in a very common parking requirement of 3.3 per thousand. So 3.3 per thousand is our minimum required, and then 5 per thousand is the maximum required. And when we look at that, we can kind of see that we have a setup with the 3.3 per thousand, and it looks like we're going to need about 80 parking spaces based on the fact that our building is roughly, and I did not do a takeoff, I apologize, but it's about 24 to 25,000 square feet over 3 floors of space. And if anybody's been to our office, you probably know we don't have 80 parking spaces. Our designated lot has about 59. So I could come into work about 7:15, so nobody's there yet, so I don't have to worry about it. But it does get kind of tight when everybody in the building is there. So that's just one thing. That's an existing facility, and let's just say the owners of our building decided to get creative. The first floor tenants left, and they thought this would be a great opportunity to turn a portion of the first floor into a restaurant. That sounds like a great idea, right? A great way to make income, a great way to bring people to our office, and it'd be awesome to have a place to go to lunch that's right downstairs. I don't have to leave, right? Well, look at the difference here. With the IL 2-1, 15 per thousand. You think that's going to be possible when we're already underparked? Probably not, right? So it's something to consider. So is that restaurant worth having to investigate additional requirements, like potentially building a structure or making agreements with our neighbors? Maybe not, right? So it's something to consider when you're changing the use of a facility. One thing that we run into a lot with the type of work that we do is a lot of our clients own warehouse buildings. And warehouses are great, but they don't make as much money as, say, manufacturing spaces, right? Manufacturing pumps out a product, makes money. So if you want to change that warehouse to, say, manufacturing, now you're going to have to consider how that gets parked. And so it was about 2 years ago, we did a project in the Mira Mesa area, and they were doing exactly that. About 2/3 of the building was a office, lab, and manufacturing space for a pharmaceutical company. And they had another third that they were considering shell space, which is also a term they use for where everybody puts stuff that doesn't have a place, right? I won't call it junk because that is definitely up to the person who put it there, but there was a lot of stuff. I think there might have been parts for 20 or 30 Weber kettle barbecues and just random stuff in there, but it was being used for something. And when we went to do the initial planning for that project, we noticed that by changing the majority of that space to manufacturing, the site was going to be underparked, and we came up with some very creative solutions to make that happen, mainly a combination of parallel parking and leveraging what they were allowing us to use for street parking to make that count work, and the project ended up going forward. So back to our example here, you can see we end up with somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 spaces required. And I actually got that wrong. We only have Oh, it is about 59. So we're still we would be way overparked if we opened up the FPBA cafe, which probably is never going to happen. So we don't have to worry about that. What I wanted to do is, instead of just kind of throwing facts and figures at you guys, because that is very hard to retain and it's hard to kind of watch, because I've been there. So what I'd like to do is just go through a couple of case studies. So this is a project that is in some part in Southern California that is a large pharmaceutical manufacturing campus. It is 26 acres and it's about 300,000 square feet, 350,000 square feet, just to make it a round number, I believe. We were asked to kind of provide them with master planning, and part of that master planning was a phase one that was completely surface parked. And so we started there. First conversation we had, like I mentioned, was how many people are you going to have in this facility? And they answered the question right away because they knew exactly how many people they needed, because their existing facility was grossly underparked and they were just anywhere and everywhere within their current office park. So first step was to figure out how many people they needed, and then we kind of moved into understanding what the zoning requirements was. So this particular area, much smaller city than San Diego, had very simple zoning, and this was actually part of a specific plan which gave it slightly different parking requirements, but not much from the rest of the city. So first thing we did is we identified the different uses. So the orange there is an office building. The purple we considered industrial manufacturing. It was a manufacturing, a utility building, and kind of a packaging type facility for the warehouse. And what we did with that is, and the warehouse is blue, is we kind of worked with the city officials so that they could understand how many people would be in a room. So they knew exactly how many people were going to need to be parked on site, because this particular development did not allow for surface parking. They actually were very strongly against it. It wasn't that you couldn't park on the street, they just didn't want you to count for it as being part of a new development, especially when you have 26 acres of land to work with, right? So we worked with them, worked with our client and the city to kind of identify different ratios, and here are some of the numbers, and this is actually directly from our plan set, so it's a little more technical than PowerPoint deserves, but and because it can't all be the same, they actually worded everything based on you needed to provide one space per 500 square feet instead of 2 per thousand like every other zoning code in the state of California. And same with their warehouse and office, it was 1 per 250 instead of 4 per thousand. But that being said, we had to go in and give them this 617 spaces at minimum, and we ended up providing closer to 700 for this project. But that kind of takes us into another requirement. One thing that's pretty important is when we look at accessibility. So how many ADA stalls did you guys see when you pulled in today? One? I think I saw one when I pulled in. 4, right? 4? You guys saw them? So it wasn't that many. This project was pretty big, so we had to provide a lot. But it's just one thing to understand, you know, the more you're providing, the more you're going to need to accommodate. So I just, you know, I don't want to harp on this too much, but when we look at parking lots, it's a very important item of consideration. So when we look at what we're providing here, and you can see here, what it says is, and it's really important, total number of parking spaces provided, right? Not just what the zoning requires. So we didn't use that. In this case today, I used the 617, I think, just to make it easier for us. But we didn't use that. We had to use our larger number. But it helps with this case because we are over that 500. There's a 2%. So if you're really good at math, you can figure out what your maximum number of parking would be before you needed another accessible stall. So anybody that could do that for me would be great, because that is not me. So what we did is we kind of just went through the calculation, and we ended up needing to provide 13 spaces. And that also, as you guys know, would include some van parking as well. And when we look at van parking, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that we're looking at, for every 6 or fraction of space that's required, we would need to provide an accessible. And it's always a bummer when you end up with 13, right? Because that means not 2, but actually 3. So we had to provide 3, and for this project, we ended up providing a lot more because it had, I think, 5 different entrances. So we accommodated all of those different entrances with the appropriate accessible parking. So this is kind of the breakdown here. 617 stalls, 13 accessible with 3 van, and that wouldn't change. I think the number was all the way up to 650 parking spaces. The number stays the same because it is that 2% of the requirement, and then we're within that range of within 6 for the van spaces. So what I like to do is I like to look at the numbers here, and when you think about it, we're surface parking 5.6 acres of space. So I used about 400, so 350, 400 square feet per parking stall to come up with that. So 5.6 acres. So how many of you guys have a facility that sits on less than 5.6 acres? I'd say that's a pretty good chunk of people, right? And so we're devoting that to asphalt and a little bit of landscape, right? Maybe not the best use of the space there. So when we look at what happens next, right? So we've surface parked, and then 10 years from now, they call us up and say, hey, we want to do another 300,000 square feet of addition. I think he's that number, we'll see. And by the way, we don't want to do a parking structure because we don't want to pay for that. That's not a good use of our funds, right? So what do? Who knows, right? We'll figure it out. So first thing we did is, this was all part of the same kind of master planning phase that we did for them, but one of the keys here was to make sure that we made it known that that would not be possible, first of all, and that you would need to be providing a parking structure. So that was part of our concept here. So when we look at increasing it by another, say, 350 parking stalls, so we're just looking at like, plus or minus 50% increase in space, then we would need 917, or I guess that's not right, but that's okay. It's just an example. Anyway, we would need the 967 spaces, which is about 8.5 acres, or 32% of our entire property. That's quite a bit of space to devote to surface parking. So we look at maybe doing a small parking structure. So if we were to do 3 levels for a total of 200 stalls, then we would just be simply parking around 700 on the surface and putting a lot of people in the 200 parking spaces within the structure. So we're going to get into why we would want to do that after we look at a couple more case studies. So another one I thought was important to take a look at was a very interesting and unique project site. So this was the Alpine branch library for the county of San Diego, and essentially we were given a site that was within a public park. So everybody in Alpine probably freaked out a little bit because they don't have a lot of public parks there, but we were able to kind of accommodate that. But either way, there was no space for parking. So we had to get really creative here. And you can see on the site plan, this area right in here used to be the extension of the park, and this was just a really steep hillside. But this is all we have, which if you guys have been to any library, do they normally just provide 20-ish spaces for their occupants, especially if it's around 13,000 square feet? Not normally, right? So we end up having an issue there. And then part of the RFP for that project was, by the way, we also need to clean up the kind of makeshift parking in the back, because there's some sports fields. There's a baseball field and some soccer fields in the corner there. And when we look at how we're going to park that as well as the library, it kind of got a little interesting. So we had some fun with it. What we did is we provided at the frontage of the road the primary parking for the library, and we were also able to kind of refine the space in the back lot and use that as part of our total count. The other factor here is there's this building in the corner here, and I'll step back so those of you on that side can see. But this is a existing community center, and they have a lot there. And technically, we weren't allowed to use that for our parking count. But if you were going to visit the Alpine Library and all of these spaces are taken, are you going to park in the back, or are you going to take one of these right here, right? So those were factored, but we'll just say they weren't because we weren't allowed to, but they're definitely part of it, because the community center is not a full-time use like an office building would be. So it was kind of, I think we were given a little bit of grace there because of the individual situation. So when we look at the totals and kind of how it all works out, we ended up with 26 spaces on the south lot, which is what you're seeing here, and then 31 on the north lot. And by the way, I don't know if any of you have ever been out there before we did this, this was kind of just dirt, and people parked however they wanted, and they made it work. So we're good, right? Just leave it dirt, and it's a lot cheaper than asphalt, right? So I wouldn't recommend that. That's right. Yeah, see? So the other one, which is a current project we have going on right now, is the Mission Hills Library. Another very constrained lot. This is a building that takes up the entire property line. And they wanted parking. We got to park it. So what do? You go down. Have you guys been seeing that a lot lately? Yep. So there it is. That's the site. It is a giant building on a small lot. And this is in the Mission Hills Hillcrest area, so it's allowed to be built right on the property line. And that's what we did. So we got them as much space as we could and pretty much shoved it in there. So when we look at parking, like I said, the only option was to go below grade. There are a few things I like about this, and we'll talk about that in a second, but when we start going down, we're looking at providing 100-ish spaces. It was about, I think it was 97 or something total, but we ended up with the 2 levels below grade, and that is sort of what we're looking at, where you have to take a ramp down and go through. So anybody drive a big giant truck in here, or lifted van or anything like that? You probably don't want to go down there, right? Because you're just asking for it. We put a little bar, like a PVC bar that you hit, but if you're in a giant lifted truck, you probably don't even notice that. So you just keep going until you get stuck, right? So that's definitely one disadvantage, but that takes us into our pros and cons here. So when we talk about surface parking, I think everybody in here has an understanding that this is the cheapest way to go, right? The cheapest way to go. So just, without saying, cost is, of the initial investment, is definitely the lowest, right? Another thing, which is very important to us today, is they're very user-friendly, right? Who's been to Horton Plaza? Okay, who's gotten lost in Horton Plaza trying to find their car? Everybody does, right? So I never go to Horton Plaza because I don't want to get lost finding my car, right? So having a surface parked lot, all you have to do is, if you forget you were there a long time, just beep the car if you've got that ability, and you can kind of see it or hear it and find it really easily. Horton Plaza, you do that, and it's right there, and you have no idea how to get to it, okay? I have a feeling that this garage might be the same way. But those are kind of, those are 2 things I think are very important. The lot being user-friendly, that is kind of an afterthought sometimes, but I think it's really critical, especially if you have a facility where you're bringing people to your building, right? That aren't there on a regular basis. So the other thing is that you're still maintaining the development potential of your site. And I think this is very important to consider because your initial investment is so low. If you have to tear it up and put a building on top of it, it's not as big of a deal. And you still have a flexible site that you can work with. So the next thing, right, and I did this in order of price here. By the way, I talked to a few of the contractors we work with, and they kind of were in the $3,000 to $4,000, depending on who I talked to, per space for surface parking, and that's all in, right? We're parking cars for that parking lot. Parking structures now. These are going to be more expensive, right? That's obvious because it's a little bit more to it. There's some structure. It's actually a building itself, and the one thing that I like about these, and you've probably seen this around town, I think North Park does a relatively good job with this, they have a low site impact because we're able to, instead of parking 600 spaces over 5 acres, we can park 600 spaces over a third of that because we can stack it 3 levels higher, whatever we need to do. So that low site impact, I think, is a huge deal because anytime we are leaving the site as is and not disturbing the natural land, we're just being better stewards as developers. When we're talking about cost here, I consider this a pro because it is a moderate cost relative to our below grade parking structures, which are, you can see, $4 signs instead of 3, whatever that means. But either way, it's a relatively cost-effective solution to parking a site. And then this came up a lot on the last project I did, which we ended up doing all surface parking anyway. But we can look at the security of the site. So sometimes you only want some people going in at certain points of time. So we can rig the whole thing with card readers, and only certain people can come in, and they're locked in and safe, secure all day, right? And that's a nice thing to have. Another part of a parking structure that I didn't mention here is it's inherently, unless you're on the top, covered parking, right? Doesn't everybody like covered parking? Yeah. I don't really care because my car is not that nice, but but it definitely is an amenity, and we've done projects where that's all we've done was provide shade structures for parking stalls. We did a RFP proposal for County of San Diego again for Borrego Springs, and one of the things that they wanted was as many covered parking stalls as we could provide, because it's hot out there and nobody wants to leave their car in 120-degree weather while they're hanging out with their kids in the library, right? You come out, you can't even sit in the thing. Imagine putting a kid in a car seat that's been baking in the sun. They're not going to want to do that, right? So having that covered parking is definitely a benefit. When we look at the cost for that, roughly, again, anywhere depending on so many factors here, but we'd say between $12,000 to $15,000 per parking stall. So we're looking at 3 times as much going from surface to a parking structure. When we look at below grade parking, we're starting to get into a more specialized type of parking here. And this takes us into one thing that I like a lot. The biggest pro, I would say, to a below grade parking structure is the pedestrian engagement. So when you're walking down Washington Avenue or University, the last thing you want to do is have to traverse, I don't know, 300, 400 feet of parking lot before you get to the store you're going to. So let's say you guys went to Costco. Who intentionally parks in the back? Nobody does. There you go. I like this table already. Yes. Some people do, some people don't. It can be very dangerous if you go to the one in Santee. I'm just letting you know. That one gets crazy. So if you park in the back, you know, we're people that come from cars into spaces, or we're people that go from, say, like a bus or a trolley stop to a development. And so just increasing that pedestrian presence and making it easier for us to get from where we started to the building is a definite benefit. I put on here more visually pleasing because have you guys seen parking structures that look good? Right? We've seen some. They exist, right? Have you seen some that don't look so good? Would you say you see more that are hideous than are something you'd actually want to live next to? Yes, you would. How many parking garages do you comment on? Not many, because you don't see them. They're below grade. They're out of sight, and they serve the purpose, right? So when we look at, again, this is sort of similar to the parking structures, but our third point here is the good use of the site area. When I talk about site area, we're already disturbing the building footprint. So if we're putting a parking structure below grade underneath the building footprint, it's already a disturbed site. So one of the things that comes up a lot, and we'll talk about this when we get into the cons, is how you treat your site's stormwater. So has anybody had any issues with that and had to spend 6 figures resolving that? Yeah, or more? Yeah. That happens, and whenever we run into these situations, we try to develop as less of the site as we possibly can, because that's what triggers the requirement for how much stormwater we're needing to treat. So using the site area as best as we possibly can is definitely a top item for us. So now we went over pros, now we'll go to the cons, and we've already talked about it. Site area consumption, okay? Imagine a campus like UCSD without any parking structures. What would that look like? What would La Jolla look like? I don't think it would exist, right? It would just be all surface parking. So there just wouldn't be, there wouldn't be a Torrey Pines, you know, none of that. It's just all parking at that point. So, you know, the biggest negative to surface parking is how much area it's going to take up. And so it's something that we have to consider when making that decision between going from a structure or garage and taking that the cheaper option of surface parking lot. Heat island effect, are you guys familiar with that term? Yeah, so the more asphalt we put down on the ground, the hotter that building is going to be, because we are just bringing more and more of that sun's radiation to our site, and that could have, you know, an adverse effect on our mechanical systems and just the comfort of the people. So Borrego Springs is another great example because it's so hot out there. Can you imagine walking, you know, 100 yards through a asphalt parking lot in the middle of summer out there? No, we'd have to have like a water station in between, like shade, to get a break. So, you know, when we talk about that, it's a big deal. Stormwater mitigation, this is something that came into effect on that case study that I showed you guys, the big campus. Because we had so much surface parking, we actually had to use a big chunk of that property for water quality basins and stormwater retention ponds. And that wasn't even enough. We had to do underground storage and treatment, which was very expensive. I have a picture of myself, and I'm about 5'4" today with these shoes. So I'm like standing in one of the underground tubes and touching the top of it like that. It was massive. I've never seen anything like it. So it was definitely eye-opening to see some of the decisions we made and how that impacted during construction. So it's something to consider. There are a lot of creative ways to integrate this within there. Instead of having as many parking spaces as you can on the surface, we could have strips of landscape that help treat the storm water, and then turning your retention basins and water quality basins into just site amenities. They don't have to be this big, nasty, you know, mucky grass pond. It could be a landscaped area with rock and different features for sure. So the cons, we talked about it for parking structures. Most of them just don't look that great. So we try to tuck them behind and do what we can, but sometimes they just don't end up in. And most of the time, I would say, with my experience, is we don't have the opportunity to put a secondary facade on it because it's just too expensive. And the projects I've worked on that have had parking structures, it wasn't a requirement of the zoning or the actual area that we were developing, so we didn't have to do it. How many of you guys have gone to like a baseball game or a football game or a concert where they've had a parking structure? Yeah, a few times? How long does it take to get out of there? Yeah, gotta go to the bathroom first, right? I would. So the limited access, right? How many entrances are there? I couldn't even tell you, honestly, here. This is so crazy. I just saw one way in, and I'm assuming that's kind of the same way out, right? So if we all left at the exact same time and just waited and said, okay, go, how long do you think it would take to get out of here? Probably way longer than we planned for, right? So that's one thing that we need to consider, is that limited access in and out of those structures. And that goes for the garages as well. The other thing, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one, the parking garages. But when we look at cost, I didn't mention it because it is a lot. It would probably be anywhere between $30,000 and $40,000 per parking space. So we're talking a lot of cash to park cars, okay? So what does a parking space in downtown cost? 300, 400, I have no idea. So like 400 a month, something like that. That's a lot that's coming back, but it's also a burden that some companies take. So our company used to be in downtown, and we moved to Kearny Mesa. So downtown, and they provided a stipend or a parking space for a lot of the senior people in our office. And I'm pretty sure that was a very expensive cost that they were happy to get rid of when we moved to Kearny Mesa with a full-on parking lot. So cost, that's the one that hurts the most, right? The next thing, and this also has to do with cost, and it's factored into that number that I gave you, is these have to be ventilated, okay? What does ventilation sound like? You guys hear it? This is a conference room, and we can hear the fan coils going crazy. So imagine if you had to exhaust for 300 cars. That's loud. And imagine if you're the person on the street that's walking by where they're blowing that air out. That's not so great either. So those are things that are definite negatives to a below grade parking structure. So last one, right? Soil. You guys familiar with soil? The impacts it can have? What if there's a section in the middle that wasn't part of the soils report and it was all rock? Who's going to remove that? Somebody's got to do it, right? So if that is kind of found, it could really increase the cost. The other thing that we've run into is if you have bad soil, like a lot of clay or something that doesn't drain well, then we just have a lot of water that could potentially be sitting around the building. And rule of thumb, right? Water, it's got to go. If we can't move it, it becomes more difficult. So that's just more cost and more problems that we run into with the below grade parking garages. So the next thing here is the Cal Green stuff that I wanted to talk about. So anybody drive an electric vehicle? Yeah? Gina, I know she does because we work together. We have a few in our office, and we have charging stations at our office, but this is something that comes up quite a bit. So actually this is the low emitting vehicles part first, which Gina's car would meet the requirement for. These are spaces that they just want you to provide in a very nice location out in front. So what is a low emitting vehicle? I have no idea. I couldn't find anything that defined it, but I would say like a Honda Civic might meet the requirement, not, you know, a Cadillac Escalade or something gigantic that gets 8 miles per gallon. Probably doesn't meet that requirement, but these are just kind of some numbers. You need to provide a certain amount and stripe it a certain way based on the code requirements of Cal Green. The next thing, and this is sort of parking, but it's bicycle parking, and this is very near and dear to me, and I'm going to admit this in front of how many people, but I messed this up, and it was bad. Not really that bad because they wanted it the way it needed to be anyway, but we missed it. And what happened was we ended up having to provide it was really the difference between short-term and the long-term requirements. But essentially the way it works is you need to provide bicycle parking within a certain number, and it's 200 feet of the entry, and it's 5% of the new visitor parking. So what we did is we termed our campus a closed campus, meaning there were never going to be visitors to that, and which was the case because they didn't really want anybody even knowing about it, which is why I haven't told you who it's for or where it is. But essentially, we had to come up with some creative solutions. So we turned what was a lunch barbecue counter into a barbecue counter kind of outdoor event space with bicycle parking below, and it actually came out really nice and well integrated, and we had also a series of those same lockers throughout the site. So just keep in mind it needs to be covered, and lockable was kind of the big deal, and a permanent structure, not just like a tent with chain link around it that you put out there. So very important because it does have a cost impact and a space impact on your campus. So back to my other point, which is much more interesting. The charging stations, right? You guys have seen them, they're around. One of the things that we've recently discovered is that the 2016 Cal Green does require you to provide provisions when you're doing a new building. So it's not like the building code is going to step in and say you have to provide charging stations. That is not necessarily the case, but you do have to provide provisions based on the actual number of parking stalls you're providing. Provisions would be like a conduit raceway from an electrical panel to the actual proposed locations. They don't have to be installed, but they do have to be provided. I would say this is almost a non-factor for us because all of the new development we've done in the past 3 years, they've wanted that. Actually, we've had a good chunk of projects where clients have come to us and said, we want to put in some electric vehicle charging stations as an amenity to our building. So what we do is we need to look at the ever important Chapter 11B. Does anybody know what I mean by that? ADA always comes back to get us, right? So if we do provide charging stations, we do need to make provisions for accessible parking. And these aren't necessarily parking stalls, and they don't count towards your parking count, but what they do is take up a lot of space. So here's diagram of a typical charging stall, and if you can kind of see, the numbers are tough, but it's actually 12 feet wide with a 5-foot aisle, and that's a weird, big size space. They are 18 feet deep, which kind of matches most requirements, and that's the van stall. So you do have to provide one van at minimum, and it kind of goes up from there. Another thing that we would be looking at here is another parking lot feature that kind of ties into electric vehicle charging stations. So you can see here, there's charging stations, right? And a Tesla, and that looks kind of familiar. But either way, you can park these underneath something that might help generate some of the electricity for your site. And so this is at the San Diego Zoo, and these are kind of solar trees that are placed throughout. I've seen these all over town. There's I think it's on Claremont Mesa Boulevard, somewhere over there. There's like a shopping center that's a giant Energy Innovation Center. That's right. It has a really big version of that. And again, remember what we said? What is this? Covered parking, right? An amenity, and it's also generating electricity and making a statement to your customers that you're making a commitment towards sustainability. So good things that we all like, right? And that's it. Questions? No? Oh, yes.
Have you seen an impact or a reaction to parking with flex schedules?
So the question is if I've seen an impact,
Yeah,
how flexible schedules can impact, and I'm assuming more of like a sales staff kind of coming and going, or
work from home.
work from home. Okay. So if people are working, not necessarily, we've done office kind of concepts where people are set up with like just touchdown stations, but that doesn't necessarily impact what the zoning requirement is, because it's still, you're providing a certain amount of office space. It could, if you had everybody there at the same time, it might not be as great from a facility standpoint, but.
So if the company committed to having flex schedules where a certain number of people are there certain times, so that no one's there all the time, it still doesn't matter because of the size of the building.
I think you might be able to argue that point. I can't say for sure because every jurisdiction is different, and I haven't run into that personally. One thing we have encountered is shift change. And so let's say you have 400 people on site from 7 to 5, and then your next shift is 150, and then the next one is 75 people. Then you can kind of work out you're not saying, well, we have 700 people that can occupy this site, so we don't need 700 parking spaces. We could probably get away with a smaller number, that kind of thing. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
Your comment on the Calgreen EV charging.
Yeah.
You said they require you to provide the pipe and the conduit, but not the charging.
Not the actual charging station. So they want you to provide it for future use. And there's a similar provision in there for photovoltaic panels on a roof as well. This is, and just to be clear, this is for new buildings only. So if you have a facility that you're doing alterations to, it doesn't apply. Okay. Sorry, that question was related to the conduit for EV charging stations. Yeah.
For your handicap parking counts, how does the desire of the company to assign those spots to specific handicapped employees affect your total count in a public lot?
So the question is, how does a specifically assigned accessible stall impact the total count? And I'm not sure, honestly. I don't, my instinct is I don't know if you can actually assign a stall. You might be able to assign a private parking area that accommodates an accessible person, but I don't know if you can actually assign that. That's a good question.
A lot of people request that.
They request that, huh?
They see the handicap stall and
Yeah.
you've got a handicap designation.
Let me look into that, and I can get back to Lisa with a response.
It turns into an HR thing and not.
Oh, absolutely,
a
yeah.
facility thing, and the HR people always say, oh, well, it's there, just put his name on it.
Yeah.
We're all stuck.
I don't know if that would be okay. So let me. I mean, it would be okay for the person who gets to park there all the time, but yeah, not for everybody else.
If you go to lunch and a handicapped customer shows up, parks in the spot,
Yeah.
they're upset, calling HR.
Yeah.
And HR is now calling us, going,
Hey, get him out of here.
person out of that space, and we say, no, can't do.
That's right. You can't just do that. So that's an interesting question.
Unions in the reading it.
Oh, oh boy, here we go. Oh, that's something I'll have to look into, yeah.
With driverless cars,
Yeah.
telecommuting, flexible work environments,
Mhm.
do you see parking regulations changing or being modified? So if you're looking at a building or building a facility that's gonna last you 30 years,
Mhm. Yeah,
but
you
you
have
gotta
to plan
park
for the future.
now,
Yeah.
how do you plan for the utilization of that space potentially in the future?
Yeah, so the question is related to pretty much, I'm just gonna ballpark it, the future
Sure.
of driving, right? So driverless cars, people not driving their own cars or even owning their own cars using services like Lyft and Uber, or just telecommuting 90% of the time and only coming in for an all-hands staff meeting. I think that's definitely a valid question, and I would like to think that our municipalities are looking at that as they rewrite the zoning codes. I can't give you a great answer for that, but I do think that is something to consider. I mean, I know areas like North Park have lower parking counts because of those things, so that's definitely a great question. Yes? Yes, you. Go ahead, no, in orange, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What is the actual smallest parking space that someone can paint? And is the ratio between compact and full-size cars changing?
So the question is,
More so to the compact?
yeah, what is the smallest parking stall that you could provide? The answer to that is it varies all over, depending on the zoning code and what is allowed per that specific plan if they have something that's smaller. The second part was, has the ratio between compact and standard size changed? City of San Diego doesn't recognize compact spaces for new developments anymore, so that kind of goes out the window. But I think the smallest one I've done is probably 8 by 18 is what we did. The big campus case study, they required 9 by 19. It's more of a suburban area, so more people driving big trucks, I guess. But it's all over the map. So I've seen as small as like 7.5, which I could park my car there, but if you have like a minivan or something, forget it. Yeah? Yes, ma'am.
What's the new technology in parking lots where you have the lights indicating that the space is taken or it's not taken?
So the question is about, I guess, just identifying if spaces are taken. I haven't seen that before, so yeah.
CSD has
There
it.
has
Oh,
a
really?
parking lot.
Oh,
It's
cool.
so cool.
Yeah.
It identifies if it's red,
Uh-huh.
the space is open, and then it has a count of, how many people are actually
Are
in the
allowed,
lot.
yeah. I've seen that, like, going into sports venues, they'll have a sign, like, saying
No,
how many
it's
are left or
actually
kind of thing.
lights above the parking space.
Oh, wow.
They're really
That
cool.
indicate if it's available or if it's taken.
Oh, that's cool. I haven't run into that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'm sure there's, we've dealt with this a number of times, but if you don't right away get the fire department involved in your site plan, you're gonna be in
Oh, yeah?
trouble, cause all of a sudden people are making really nice parking and they're doing all that, and all of a sudden the fire department says, it's not wide enough. Like,
Yep.
we can't get our truck in there.
Yeah, so the question is, it's really more of a comment, considering the fire department when doing this type of campus planning. And I'll tell you, our first meeting was with the client, obviously. Second, planning department, and who do you think we met with third? Fire department. And you know what they said? We need another curb cut. And we need a bunch of other things, but that is a different presentation because that can go, that is definitely a very smart thing to consider is making sure you're working with your local fire marshal and getting them on board right away. So yes.
I had read an article recently that companies that are building new parking structures are building them with the intent to be able to turn them into an office space in the
Yeah.
future. Are you seeing that?
I haven't seen that personally. So the question was regarding parking structures being built in a way that they could potentially be turned into office space in the future, because essentially the framework for a parking structure is the same thing for an office building or a residential tower. So I haven't seen that personally, but I have read articles about people developing, and this is crazy, but developing parking stalls that they rent into living units. So I remember seeing, it was like it ended up being just crazy grass out front. So
In response to that, typically your floor height for an office building about 14 feet.
Yes, that's a good point.
Height for a parking structure is 10 feet.
Yeah, so Walt has a very good point here. The floor-to-floor height between a office building, you might be looking at 14 feet or so, and a parking structure is going to be much less, around 10 feet. So
You'd have to build it.
you wouldn't be getting your 9-10 foot ceilings in that office building. You may not like what you get. Yeah. Anybody else?
Any
Yep,
other
go ahead.
questions for Michael?
What about motorcycle parking? I haven't seen that anymore.
So the question was about motorcycle parking, and most of the time they just take standard spaces. That depends on the jurisdiction you're working with. The last 2 projects I've done wasn't even a requirement, and so it wasn't provided. Yeah.
Wow.
Okay.
Well, excellent. Let's give Michael a hand.
Thank you, guys.